Alright, this morning in our private video session here, we're going to be talking about how to find time between values. And if you ever work at a consulting firm, especially for smaller companies, this is a very popular request. A lot of companies don't know how to do this. I will say that we're going to be going over bad database design in the sense that a lot of these requests, you will look at the database and say, this is just poorly designed. They're small companies and they usually don't know how to do things correctly. So as a case in point, what we're going to do is I'm going to build a table called time gaps here. We're going to insert some data into it. And just to kind of take a peek at these data, and we're going to say, let's suppose that our client comes to us and they say, what we want is we would like, this was the first query that is, we would like to get the earliest date, the difference between the earliest date to the latest date. So they want to know how long it's been from, in this case for client 1, from the 15th to the 20th, for client 2 from the 15th to February 1st, and from client 3 from the 1st of January to February 10th. So this is what they come and they provide. And I'll give you kind of a live example of this in the sense of this actually does come up quite often. I had a client one time want to track how many times in her table she would have people come to a conference event and how many people would sign up after her conference, how long it was for the people to sign up. And again, when I said bad database design, technically, if you have a conference, you should have a table that has people who have attended the conference. This could be, for instance, your client ID. And then you would have another table that would be signups. And you would do a join between those tables. I would never lump them all into the same table. But let's just say hypothetically that they do. And again, sometimes you're going to be handed a project where this is how people have organized the data. And no, you're not allowed to give them any input. Or you can and they just ignore it. And we've all been in that situation before. Okay, and so what we're going to do here is we're just going to run this select query, and what it's going to do is it's going to grab the earliest date, the minimum date, and the max date, and you'll notice it's grouping by client, even though we don't see client, but I can go ahead and throw client on here, and we can do distinct client. And what you'll see is that it will grab the earliest date, the maximum date, and the difference between the two dates. I do diffy just because difference is a keyword. That's the only reason why. And so, for instance, with client 3 it was 40 days, with client 2 it was 17 days, with client 1 it was 5 days. And that's, again, very useful for a lot of these people who organize their data that way. Now, again, let's go back and look at these data. And here's another common request when you have data like this. Or again, when you're dealing with a client who has data like this. Suppose the client comes and says, okay, well, what I want is I want the difference between the very latest date and the date that's previous to the latest date. So in this case, we only have two values. So the difference between these two values, these two values. But notice on 3, this is the earliest and this is the latest. This is the latest and this is the next latest. And so what they're wanting now is they want the next latest value. So they want the difference between these two values. Okay? Now, there are several different approaches. There are actually multiple approaches to this. I decided to use an approach that demonstrates an OR in an inner join. So I'm actually going to build a temp table so that I can do this. You do not need to build a temp table. You could use a couple of common table expressions and accomplish this task. But to demonstrate an OR, I decided to go ahead and build a temp table. So what I've done is I've declared a temp table here. And I have inserted the row number, the client, and I've inserted the client, so the unique client, the maximum time, and the maximum -1, the maximum ID -1. So let's just briefly look. This actually throws it all together. And by the way, this code is on my my Google Drive. So for those of you who have access to it, you can use it and play around with it. So let's just look at this. So you have the ID, you have the client, you have the contact date. What this is doing is it's grabbing the distinct client, it's grabbing the maximum ID, And notice how the ID is formed. We're partitioning by the client and we're ordering by the contact date. So when we look at this, and we could go ahead and no, well, actually we could. Let's just go ahead and throw on contact date just to demonstrate this. Yeah. And you will see when we pull that all, how the ID is being the maximum ID. So this is max ID, and this is max minus 1 ID. You will see how this is being formed here. So the max ID, when we grab the max ID, so it's going to be 2, 2, 3. Max minus 1 is going to be 2, 1, and obviously 0 here, 1, 0, 1, 0. Okay, so that's where that comes. That's just what it all looks like. Just to show, basically just like in math, we always show our work. Okay, so we're grabbing the max minus 1 and we're grabbing the max ID. So again, with clients 1 and 2, there's only 2 values. With client 3, that's where you can see the difference. Because here's client 3, we know the max value is 3, right? But the max minus 1 is 2. Notice in these, of course, it's just 1. So that's pretty easy. So we're going to insert it into that temp table, and this is where we're going to demonstrate our inner join. I'm going to delete this. I don't know why that's there. Okay, so now I've thrown the common table expression, and this common table expression is doing exactly what the above does. It grabs no row number over partition by client, contact, order by contact date, ID, client, and the contact date. Now we select the maximum contact date, the minimum contact date, and the date difference, kind of like the above query. And you'll notice we're doing this from the org, this right here. We're joining on the temp table, and this is where the or is at, and this is the trick. Now, I have not covered this before. When you throw out an inner join, and I will show you what the answer looks like. Let's just do it this way, and then I'll show you the error, because a lot of times people look in the error. And by the way, we know from the previous that this is correct, this is correct. Remember how the other one was 40? This is correct because that's 26. It's going to be less. Okay, this is what trips up people in an inner join that involves an OR. They'll do an inner join, pop P on client P equals O dot client, and here. Then they throw out an OR here, and they almost always forget to do this. Remember that if you have an OR, this condition right here is not recognizing this condition. These conditions are recognizing each other. This condition is not recognizing this condition. So you have to restate that condition. And let's just show you what it looks like. And it will either provide an error or it will get really incorrect. And yeah, you see it's actually bad data. This is actually the answer to the other problem. And that's because this join right here, or this condition on this join, when you throw out an OR, if it was just inner join this or something, that would be fine. But if it's inner join this or this, then there needs to be another and there. And so anytime that I have troubleshooted an inner join statement, and I say this commonly, this is probably one of the biggest errors that I've seen. A lot of people forget when you throw out an OR, and that's why I would not do this approach. I'm using this overcomplicated approach in general, just because it's a good example of where you'll see some errors with inner joins. But usually it's people have built this long query and they forget that, or sometimes they don't forget, that if they put if they put an OR, whether it's an inner join, whether it's a where clause, that's going to really change the dynamic of your query. So you need to make sure that if there's all these conditions up here and then you have an OR, you need to still make sure that those other conditions match if you want them to match. That's a big if. Otherwise, if not, you'll get the wrong data. And so you'll see that, again, we have the minimum date, we have the date before the max, and we have the max date here. And you can take this further and further and further and further. Again, in both of these examples, my primary thing I would say as a consultant is I would tell people, you have very poor database design here. This is not a way to design a database. What is it about the earliest date and the maximum date or the previous date? If these are visits to a hospital, then we need to take a different approach. By the way, this would actually be very common too as well in the medical industry. I could see the medical industry tracking the times between patient visits, or a mechanic shop tracking time between visits. That would be something very useful to them. But in general, if it's something like, and I've seen this a lot in sales, well, we had a conference, we had people sign up for or we had people come to our conference, and we want to see the date that they register. That's two tables. That's not the same table. And you could actually build an associative table with a client and then link it between those two tables. So, but otherwise, that will show you how to look for, gosh, my mind went blank, how to find time between values. This is very different, by the way, than the video of finding gaps between data. The gaps between data is looking if it's over a minute between each value. This is actually calculating the time between two values.